I understood my children were preparing to bury me before I was dead on a Tuesday in November. In the library my wife had loved more than any room in the house. The door was half open. Firelight moved across the carpet. Eve was standing by the drinks cabinet with one of my crystal tumblers in her hand, though she had never liked whiskey, and Daniel was at my desk, leaning over a folder he had no business opening. I had come back for the fountain pen Helen gave me on our 30th anniversary. Instead, I heard my daughter say very calmly, "If he takes the tablets before Thursday, Kessler will sign. Once Kessler signs, the board will follow. He won't even know what he's agreeing to." Daniel answered in the low, impatient voice he used with waiters and junior lawyers. "He'll know enough to resist if we do this badly. We only need a month." 30 days, then Blackwater goes on the market, the company debt clears, and Rosemere can take him before Christmas. Rosemere was a private residence in Kent for old men with excellent tailoring and nowhere left to go. They said the word as if it were a kindness. I stood very still in the corridor with Helen's pen case in my hand and listened to my son ask whether my signature would still be usable once the medical report was filed. Eve said yes. Eve always said yes in a tone that made ruin sound administrative. Daniel laughed once, softly, and said, "Mother would have hated the mess, but she would have understood necessity." That was the moment I stopped feeling surprise. Betrayal is often recognized before it is confirmed. You know the shape of it from the pressure it puts on the air. I did not go into the room. I did not accuse them. I had spent 40 years building Bernett Holdings from 2 river warehouses, 1 transport license, and a talent for noticing weakness before the man across the table noticed his own. I knew the difference between anger and information. Anger spends itself. Information compounds. So I stepped back from the door, walked quietly down the corridor, and returned to my bedroom with the same measured pace I had used the night Helen told me she was dying. She had been sitting at her vanity then, brushing her hair with the silver-backed brush her mother left her. She did not look at me when she said it. Neither of us liked theater. "We are going to be efficient about this, James," she said. "You may grieve after the paperwork." That was Helen. She believed in feeling deeply and moving precisely. I loved her for both. She died 18 months before the night in the library. Breast cancer. Fast in the end, though not fast enough to spare us the understanding of what was being lost. In the last week, she touched my wrist and said, "Do not become soft where you should become clear. Grief makes weak people hungry and strong people blind." I thought she was speaking about the board, or the cousins who appeared at funerals with stories about blood and envelopes. I did not think she meant our children. That failure was mine. I had always believed that whatever hardness existed in me had stopped at the threshold of home. Men believe things like that when they have enough money to protect the illusion. My name is James Bernett. I am 68 years old. I built a property and logistics group that people in the papers used to call disciplined, and people in the industry called ruthless when the microphones were off. Both descriptions were fair. I married Helen Ray at 29 after 6 months of argument, appetite, and mutual recognition. She was the only person who ever looked at my ambition as if it were neither admirable nor shameful, merely one of the tools I had brought with me into the marriage. We had 2 children, Daniel first, then Eve. Daniel came into the world red-faced and furious, as if offended by the terms of his own arrival. Eve learned very young that silence could control a room better than tears. I loved them in the way men like me often do. I paid attention to outcomes. I taught them to read contracts, to sit through long dinners without fidgeting, to distinguish between vanity and leverage, and to never say more than necessary. I assumed character would develop by proximity. Helen said once, after Daniel manipulated a tutor into taking the blame for his own cheating, "You are teaching them control without teaching them conscience." I answered that conscience was easy when there was nothing to lose. She looked at me for a long time and said, "That is why you need it before you have anything." I remember the line now with more respect than comfort. After Helen's death, I withdrew in ways that looked, from the outside, like dignity. I kept the office. I attended the quarterly meetings. I signed what needed signing. I wore dark suits and accepted casseroles from women I had never noticed before. But inside the house I became inattentive. Blackwater, our home on the river in Surrey, grew quieter and more managed. Eve began taking over details of the foundation Helen had built for women leaving violent homes. Daniel increased his presence inside the holding company, first as if asking permission, then as if acting by inheritance. The old staff started disappearing in small ways. Martin, who had run the estate books for 19 years, took early retirement. Selina, Helen's house manager, was replaced by a younger woman from an agency who called me Mr. Bernett in a tone so polished it contained no person at all. My study was reorganized. My tablets appeared in little silver dishes instead of the amber bottles I preferred. Daniel started using words like transition and stewardship. Eve started asking whether I had considered simplifying the family structure while I was still healthy enough to enjoy the process. Grief is a useful disguise for other people's appetite. Everyone forgives disorientation in a widower. The widower himself mistakes intrusion for care because the alternative requires too much energy to name. The first thing that truly disturbed me was not the conversation in the library. It was my grandson Oliver asking me, over Sunday lunch, whether I would have internet at Rosemere. He was 9. Children do not invent the names of institutions. "Your mother mentioned it?" I asked. He shrugged and picked at his potatoes. "She said maybe you'd like friends your own age. She said houses this big are hard for old men after they lose their wives." The room seemed to narrow around his small voice. Daniel's wife, Rebecca, lowered her eyes to her plate. Eve reached for the water jug too quickly. Daniel smiled the smile he used in meetings when a number went the wrong way, but he still intended to win. "Oliver hears things," he said. "We've discussed options in case you ever want more support." More support. It is always support when the powerful begin removing your choices. I said nothing. I carved the lamb. I asked Oliver about school. But that night I opened the drawer of Helen's writing desk, took out the old address book she refused to digitize, and called Miriam Vale. Miriam had been our solicitor for 23 years, one of the last people left in my life who had known me before success made other people careful around me. She answered on the second ring, listened without interruption, and when I told her I needed discretion more than reassurance, she said, "Then I suggest you stop taking anything handed to you in a silver dish, and let me come tomorrow." Miriam arrived just after 10 the next morning, carrying a narrow leather folder, and wearing the expression of a woman who had already found enough to confirm her suspicions. We sat in the small morning room overlooking the river, because Helen used to say no one lies comfortably where there are flowers. Miriam had done what good lawyers do. She had not asked broad questions. She had pulled specific threads. Daniel, it turned out, had spent the past 2 years expanding the company's boutique hotel arm with money that did not properly exist. He had guaranteed acquisitions through subsidiary debt, pledged future cash flow twice, and entered a personal side arrangement with a financing group in Luxembourg that used Bernett assets as implicit comfort without formal board approval. Eve had been less reckless, and in some ways, worse. She had borrowed against the Foundation's art fund, moved money through 3 advisory accounts to cover a settlement from her divorce, and signed letters implying my approval for a restructuring I had never seen. Neither of them could regularize the exposure while I remained fully in command and fully in possession of my mind. So they had chosen the older and cleaner solution. Diminish the father, consolidate the assets, call it continuity. Miriam slid a photocopy across the table. It was a draft petition for a limited protective appointment based on concerns about my recent cognition, sleep disturbance, and grief-related confusion. Attached to it was a proposed medical statement from Dr. Andrew Kessler, a discreet consultant Daniel had somehow found the budget to retain. Beneath that sat a property valuation for Blackwater and a proposal to liquidate one of Helen's shelters. I looked at the numbers for a long time and felt something inside me settle into a colder shape. They were not trying to take the business. They were trying to make my life convenient to the theft. "You can stop this immediately," Miriam said. "We file injunctions, notify the board, remove both from access, and let the scandal begin now." I shook my head. Not yet. She understood at once, because good lawyers are often also good students of revenge. "You want the full picture." "I want them certain," I said. "People are most honest when they think the difficult part is over." Miriam folded her hands. "Then you will need to perform weakness carefully. Can you do that?" I almost smiled. I had been performing acceptable versions of myself for most of my life. The next 3 weeks were among the ugliest of my marriage, though Helen was already dead. I stopped swallowing the tablets Eve arranged in porcelain dishes and began leaving them tucked under napkins, in jacket linings, inside the old bronze planter in the south corridor. I let my eyes linger too long before answering ordinary questions. I asked Daniel to remind me of a board date I already knew. I allowed Eve to repeat a story I had heard the day before. Once, when Dr. Kessler visited Blackwater under the pretense of concern from the family, I appeared in a cardigan Helen had disliked and deliberately mixed up the year of our second warehouse acquisition with the year Daniel was born. Kessler watched me with the hungry sympathy of a man billing by the hour. He asked whether I ever became disoriented in my own home. I told him sometimes grief made every room feel borrowed. It was true enough to be useful. He wrote it down with evident satisfaction. There is no easier prey than a sad old man if the people observing him need his sadness to become evidence. While I played the part they had written for me, Miriam and I rearranged what could still be rearranged. Bernett Holdings had always been controlled through a private family company with layered voting rights, a structure I had kept because it allowed speed and privacy. It now allowed something else. Over 8 days, through meetings held in chambers, side offices, and once in the back room of the church hall Helen used for winter drives, we transferred the controlling voting shares into an irrevocable employee stewardship trust named after Helen. The foundation was separated entirely from family management and placed under independent trustees, including 2 women Helen had sheltered 15 years earlier, who now ran their own organizations with more integrity than my children had ever displayed. Blackwater itself, along with the riverside cottages and the orchard Helen restored, went into a life interest structure that allowed me to remain until death, but prohibited sale, collateralization, or redevelopment by descendants. Daniel and Eve remained beneficiaries of fixed annual income, enough to live without indignity, but only if they did not contest the arrangements, interfere with the shelters, or attempt recovery of trust assets through concealment. Miriam wrote those clauses with a delicacy I admired. She said punishment works best when it dresses as governance. At the same time, our forensic accountants documented every transfer, every unauthorized comfort letter, every personal benefit disguised as operational necessity. By the second week, I had emails, board drafts, account trails, and recordings from my own study, where Daniel and Eve had become incautious enough to discuss timelines in front of a voice assistant Daniel himself had installed for my convenience. I did not enjoy collecting the evidence. That is the part sentimental people misunderstand about revenge. If you are still close enough to be hurt, every proof cuts twice. I learned things in those weeks that would have been easier not to know. Daniel had told his wife the company would be his by spring. He had also told a lender in Monaco that family resistance would be medically managed. Eve had assured a journalist she would soon take over the philanthropic arm, after a difficult but necessary transition from patriarchal control. One evening, I passed the small sitting room beside the east stairs, and heard her telling a friend on speakerphone that men like her father should be removed from power before they turned sentimental and expensive. I stood outside the door, listening to my daughter explain me as if I were already a case study. It was the word sentimental that remained with me. I had been many things as a father, demanding, distant, impressed by discipline and embarrassed by need. But sentimental was not a charge I had ever expected from my own child. Then again, perhaps it was not a charge. Perhaps it was the insult of people who confuse affection with exploitable softness. For a few hours that night I did wonder whether I had created the exact conditions for this betrayal. I had taught them succession before sacrifice, literacy in power before literacy in shame. Daniel once came to me at 16 after a fight at school and asked whether being feared was better than being liked. I told him being underestimated was better than both. He remembered. Children always remember the sentences that should have been qualified. The decisive moment came not through the accountants or the documents, but through Rebecca. Daniel's wife asked if she might see me privately. She met me in the old greenhouse at the edge of the south lawn, the one Helen had insisted on saving even when the roof leaked every winter. Rebecca was not a dramatic woman. She came from a family of doctors and had married Daniel with the steady optimism of someone who thought intelligence and love could civilize each other. That illusion had not survived. She stood beside the potting table in a dark coat, twisting her wedding ring. "I'm not here because I'm noble," she said. "I'm here because Oliver heard Daniel say you'd be easier to handle once they moved you. I can forgive ambition. I can't forgive making our son part of it." Then she handed me a folder of printed emails Daniel had sent from his private account to Eve. In them, he referred to me as inventory, spoke about timing sedation around board dates, and complained that grief had not made me incompetent enough quickly enough. Rebecca cried only once, and very briefly, when she said, "He sounded pleased when Kessler said cognitive decline can be framed compassionately." I touched her shoulder and did not offer comfort I could not honestly feel. She asked whether I would destroy Daniel. I answered, "He has done most of the work himself." "And Eve?" she asked. "Eve," I said, "mistook elegance for innocence." Rebecca left Daniel a week later, though that belongs more to his punishment than my plan. Still, I mention her because revenge rarely remains confined to the intended target. It spreads through marriages, children, dinner tables, and the private architecture of loyalty. By the time you are done, the room is never damaged only where you aimed. I decided to end it at the Winter Appeal Dinner, the largest annual event attached to Helen's foundation. Eve had insisted on hosting it at the Ashcroft Hotel, our flagship property in Mayfair, because the guest list would be strong and the press photographs clean. Daniel approved because half the board would already be present, and he believed, wrongly, that I intended to step aside publicly in a gesture of dignified fatigue. They built the evening around my supposed transition. The printed program described me as founder, widower, guardian of a legacy entering a new chapter. Eve chose cream flowers because Helen disliked white arranged too severely. Daniel briefed the staff to keep the event intimate, which meant expensive and controlled. On the afternoon of the dinner, I dressed without assistance, tied my own tie, selected the dark navy suit Helen once said made me look less like a prosecutor, and stood for a long time in front of her portrait in the dressing room. I told her, aloud, that I had failed to see this coming. Then I told her I would finish it cleanly. Downstairs, the cars were already arriving. London in December has a way of making wealth look both theatrical and exhausted. Women stepped out of black cars in silk and fur. Men adjusted cuffs under yellow light and discussed market conditions as if markets had feelings. I greeted donors, shook hands, kissed cheeks, and let my children perform concern around me. Eve smoothed my lapel. Daniel asked whether I was tired. I said, "Not tonight." He took it for sentiment. He always was a little deaf to tone unless money was attached to it. The ballroom was full by 8. I sat through speeches about resilience, rebuilding, women saved by structures of care. I thought of Helen throughout. She had started the first shelter with 3 friends and a borrowed church annex because she was tired of hearing men in suits describe violence as a social issue rather than a private decision. "Everything important happens in rooms too small for policy language," she said once. I looked around the Ashcroft ballroom and saw donors lifting crystal glasses to that principle while my own children waited to use her memorial for acquisition by another name. When dessert was cleared, Eve took the stage with her careful smile. She spoke beautifully about continuity, about preserving Helen's vision across generations, about my long stewardship and the natural transfer of responsibility that families must sometimes embrace with grace. She invited me to the podium for what the program called a personal reflection. I remember the walk more than the speech. The room became very quiet. Daniel rose slightly from his chair, ready to assist me in a display of filial tenderness rehearsed for photographers. I did not take his arm. At the podium, I placed both hands on the wood and let the silence stay just a little too long enough for attention to sharpen. Then I thanked the donors, the trustees, the staff, and Helen in that order, because hierarchy matters even in grief. I said she had taught me that care without structure becomes sentiment, and structure without conscience becomes appetite. Eve's face changed first. Not fear, recognition. Daniel still thought he could manage the room. I told them that age had indeed forced clarity on me, though not the kind some had anticipated. I said I had spent 18 months understanding what remains of a man once his wife is gone, and that the answer, if he is fortunate, is not appetite but duty. Then I began naming facts. Not many. Facts do not require abundance if they are placed well. I announced that, effective immediately, the controlling voting interest in Bernett Holdings had been transferred into the Helen Bernett Employee Stewardship Trust, to be administered by an independent board with no hereditary seats. Murmurs moved across the ballroom like wind passing through a field. I let them. Then I said Blackwater, and all associated heritage properties had been placed into protected charitable stewardship and could not be sold, borrowed against, or redeveloped by family members. Daniel went pale with a suddenness that almost looked comic. Eve remained perfectly still, except for one hand tightening on the stem of her glass. I continued. I said the Helen Bernett Foundation would no longer be managed by descendants, and that 2 current family officers had been suspended pending formal review of financial misconduct, unauthorized asset representations, and attempted coercive interference in governance. That was when the room stopped pretending this was a retirement announcement. People sat straighter. Someone at table 6 put down a fork with an audible click. I lifted the folder Miriam had placed beneath the podium and read, in a voice that carried further than I expected, excerpts from the forensic findings. Not the vulgar parts, not the numbers that would make the papers happy. Only enough to establish pattern, intention, and betrayal. I mentioned the medical petition prepared without my knowledge, the proposed residential relocation, the unauthorized use of foundation resources, the comfort letters, and the sedation discussion. On that last item, I looked directly at my children. For the sake of precision, I said, I should add that I do know what I am agreeing to tonight. It was the cruelest line I have ever spoken in public. I knew that as I said it. Daniel stood before I had finished. Chairs scraped. Rebecca caught Oliver's shoulder and kept him seated. "This is absurd," Daniel said. "You're confused and being manipulated." His voice cracked on manipulated. Eve remained seated another 3 seconds, then rose with the look she wore in divorce photographs, polished sorrow arranged over active calculation. "Father," she said into the silence, "perhaps we should take this privately. You are clearly distressed." It was almost beautiful, the speed with which she reached for the old man's script. Miriam stepped onto the stage from the side entrance then, carrying the formal suspension notices with the auditors behind her. Not security. I had insisted on that. Security is for men who need spectacle. Paper is for men who want permanence. Miriam handed the envelopes to Daniel and Eve in full view of the room. "You have both been removed from all immediate decision-making authority," she said. "Additional documents will be served tonight." Daniel made a sound I had not heard from him since childhood, something between fury and disbelief. He looked at me as if I had violated the natural order by remaining more dangerous than expected. Eve took the envelope and asked very softly, "You planned this at Mother's dinner?" "No," I said. "You planned yours at hers." That landed harder than the notices. You could feel it in the room. People looked away not out of sympathy, but because they had suddenly found themselves witnessing the one thing wealth never conceals well: family truth under formal light. The event did not collapse. That is the detail most people would get wrong. No one shouted beyond the first exchange. No glasses were thrown. The orchestra did not stop mid-note because I had dismissed them before I spoke. Wealth teaches people how to absorb scandal without disorder. Guests moved into smaller knots of conversation. The trustees gathered in the blue drawing room for immediate signatures. The auditors took Daniel aside with the kind of courtesy that precedes institutional death. Eve disappeared for 12 minutes and returned without lipstick, which was the only outward sign she had been shaken at all. The press, by agreement, had not yet received documents, though by midnight they would. I remained in the ballroom answering questions from donors, board members, and 2 women from the shelters who looked at me with something like pity. It was almost harder than the confrontation. Public revenge feels sharp in imagination and administrative in practice. There are forms to sign, authority to confirm, calm voices to maintain. Twice I caught myself searching the room for Helen as if she might emerge from behind the winter arrangements and tell me whether I had gone too far or not far enough. Near 10:30, Rebecca came to stand beside me. She did not touch my arm. She simply said, "Oliver is with the driver. He won't hear anything else tonight." I thanked her. She nodded once and left. I think she understood, perhaps better than I did in that moment, that what had happened on that stage was not a victory. It was a necessary ending executed before more innocence could be spent. My children found me just after 11 in the private library above the west staircase, a smaller room than Blackwater's library, and therefore a better room for honesty. Daniel entered first without knocking. His tie was loose, his eyes bright with the ugly clarity of humiliation. Eve came after him, closed the door, and remained near it as if instinctively preserving the geometry of control. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Daniel said, "You ruined everything." There are lines children reserve for parents because they still half believe consequence is an act of preference. I sat in the leather chair by the window and looked at him carefully. "No," I said, "you built everything you saw tonight. We were saving the company. You were saving yourself." He moved closer. "You think those staff trustees can do what I can? You think sentiment and old loyalty can manage debt, development, international exposure? I think theft disguised as urgency is still theft." He laughed once, bitterly. "You taught me urgency." That line struck deeper than I let him see. He was not wrong. Eve stepped in then, as she always did when emotion threatened to become vulgar. "Let us not pretend this is about ethics," she said. "This is about control. You would rather hand your empire to employees and strangers than your own blood." "Blood," I said. "Asked whether my signature would remain usable after a doctor lied about my mind." For the first time her composure shifted, only slightly. Her chin lowered. "You were slipping," she said. "After Mother, you were absent. Deals stalled. Trustees complained. The company became exposed because you refused to decide. Somebody had to." I looked at my daughter and saw, with terrible clarity, the child who once organized her dolls by rank and exclusion before she was old enough to understand either. "So you decided to medicate me, move me out, sell your mother's work, and call it care." Eve's voice cooled again. "We decided to survive the structure you built. None of us were raised to be ordinary, Father." That was the truest thing spoken in the room. I should tell you that I loved them even then. Not in a forgiving way. Not in a way that softened the decisions already made. But love does not vanish because it becomes impossible. It remains as knowledge. the particular way Daniel pushed hair back from his forehead when cornered, the way Eve pressed her thumbnail into her palm when she chose not to cry, the sound of their breathing while they waited to see whether blood, at the final moment, would still rescue them from consequence. I stood up slowly. I am tall, and age has not yet taken that from me. "You want the truth?" I asked. "Here it is. I made both of you fluent in power before I made you answerable to anything. I admired sharpness in you because I mistook resemblance for legacy. Your mother saw it earlier. I did not. That failure belongs to me. This," and I touched the folders on the table between us, "belongs to you." Daniel stared as if he might strike me, but he had never been physical. Men like him outsource damage. Eve said, "Will you press criminal charges?" "I will not interfere with what the board, the trustees, or the authorities decide." Daniel swore under his breath. Eve's face went almost expressionless. "So, this is revenge." "No," I said. "Revenge would have been keeping you close enough to beg. This is removal." It was a cruel distinction. I chose it anyway. Daniel turned away first. He looked suddenly much older than his 42 years. Eve remained another moment. "Mother would hate this," she said. "Your mother," I answered, "would hate what made it necessary." She opened the door and left without another word. Daniel followed. When they were gone, the room felt colder, not emptier. Colder. There is a difference. The newspapers did what newspapers do. By morning, the story had become a study in dynasty, collapse, and elegant disgrace. Founder Oost's heirs in governance revolt. Memorial Gala turns on family fraud. Photographs of me at the podium made me look sterner than I felt and perhaps kinder than I deserved. Daniel resigned from every remaining post before the board could terminate him publicly. His lenders, deprived of imagined inheritances and informal comfort, became less patient. By February, 2 of his ventures had entered restructuring. Rebecca filed for divorce in March and moved with Oliver to a house nearer her parents. She did not ask me for money. I sent for Oliver every second weekend anyway, and taught him how to prune roses badly, which is the only honest way for boys to learn. Eve fought more cleanly. She retained excellent counsel, reviewed every clause, and came close to contesting the trust before discovering that Challenge would forfeit the annual income entirely and direct her portion into Helen's shelters. She called Miriam vindictive in writing. Miriam preserved the email. Eventually, Eve left England for Geneva under the pretense of consulting work and the practical reality of retreat. We have exchanged 3 letters in 14 months, all polite, none warm. Daniel wrote once, 6 pages of blame that became confession in the middle and ended as accusation again. I burned it unread after the 2nd page, which was perhaps less noble than I would like to claim. Some men read pain as duty. I have read enough of mine. People asked whether I regretted doing it publicly. The answer is complicated. Publicly was not for humiliation, though humiliation came. It was because secrecy had been the instrument of the betrayal. They had relied on quiet paperwork, discreet doctors, softened language, and private transitions that would leave me contained before objection could gather shape. To answer that kind of attack in whispers would have preserved their method even while defeating their plan. I wanted witnesses, not crowds. Witnesses. The board had to see. The trustees had to see. The donors whose money carried Helen's work had to see that family is not an ethical category. It is only proximity. Character remains separate. Still, there were nights afterward when I walked through Blackwater and felt less like a victor than a caretaker admitted after a fire. The house survived. The smoke remained. Helen's dressing room stayed untouched except for dusting. Her gardening gloves were still folded on the bench by the back door. In the blue guest room, there was a faint mark on the wall where Eve had once thrown a hairbrush at 16, because I refused to let her go to Ibiza with a man 10 years older. In Daniel's old room, I found a rowing medal and a bottle opener engraved with his initials. The dead do not haunt houses half so effectively as the living versions of themselves you can no longer reach. Spring came late that year. The river looked metallic well into April. I spent more time outside, less from serenity than from habit. Men raised in work do not become reflective on schedule. We simply move tasks outdoors when the weather permits. The shelters continued. Under independent management, they expanded better than they had under family stewardship, which pleased me and humiliated me in equal measure. Bernett Holdings stabilized once Daniel's hidden exposures were isolated and sold. The employees on the new stewardship board were neither sentimental nor naive. It turned out Martin, who had taken early retirement, had in fact been pushed out after questioning some of Daniel's internal allocations. He returned as an advisor for 6 months and enjoyed his revenge in the only dignified form available to accountants: accuracy. Once, in June, I attended the opening of a new housing transition unit funded in Helen's name. One of the women speaking had spent 6 years in a marriage she thought was normal, because no one ever hit her hard enough to leave a mark. Control often arrives dressed as concern, she said from the podium. I nearly laughed at the precision of it. Later, in the car home, I wondered whether I had mistaken some older forms of control in myself for fatherhood. Not what Daniel and Eve did. Not that, but something adjacent. The belief that provision absolves distance. The assumption that instruction counts as intimacy. Quiet revenge leaves room for those questions because it does not drown them out with noise. The only meeting I had alone with Daniel after the gala happened in September, almost 10 months later. He asked if he could come to Blackwater. I nearly refused. Then I remembered Helen's view that final clarity should not be denied merely because it arrives late. He came on a gray afternoon wearing a coat too expensive for his circumstances and shoes that needed repair. Defeat had not made him humble. It had made him thinner. We sat in the study with the windows open to the river and the old clock making the room feel more formal than either of us deserved. Daniel did not apologize immediately. Men like him, like me, do not begin there. He asked after my health. I asked after his work. He said he was consulting. I said that sounded vague. Then he laughed, and for 1 second I heard the boy he had been at 13 when he broke his arm falling from the lower oak, and tried not to cry because I was watching. "All right," he said. "I came because I wanted to know whether you ever intended to leave it to us." "What?" "Any of it. The company, the house, the authority. Or were we always just auditioning for a thing you planned to die holding?" That question deserved more honesty than comfort. I looked at my son and said, "I intended to leave you something better than ownership. I intended to leave you prepared. I failed to understand that preparation without limits becomes entitlement." Daniel lowered his eyes. "You never said you were proud of me." It was the oldest wound in the room, and perhaps the truest. "No," I said. I usually said what was next. He nodded once, as if confirming a private theory. Then maybe I was trying to take the sentence after that. He left an hour later with no forgiveness on either side, but with less falsehood between us. At my age, that counts. I have not seen Eve in person since the gala. Her letters are careful. She writes about art fairs, board opportunities, and mountain light in Switzerland. Once she wrote that distance had given her a more nuanced view of family systems. It sounded like something she would say to a room before asking for money. But in the margin of that same letter she added, in smaller handwriting, "I keep thinking of Mother taking cuttings in the rain because she did not trust anyone else with the roots." That was the nearest she has come to grief, and because it came sideways, I believed it. I answered only that her mother trusted people more than either of us understood, but never after they had lied twice. I do not know whether Eve loved me in a way she could recognize separate from inheritance. I do know she loved her mother. Sometimes that has to be enough to keep contempt from hardening into something final. People romanticize estrangement when they have not lived it past the first season. In truth, it is administrative at first, then repetitive, then quietly physical. There are fewer names at the table, fewer birthdays to remember, fewer reasons to keep the larger set of china. Even anger grows tired and leaves behind arrangement. I think that is why old houses matter. They carry continuity when affection fails. Now, when people ask me about revenge, they expect either satisfaction or remorse. They are disappointed by the answer. Quiet revenge is neither. It is not the heat of striking back and not the grace of rising above. It is colder than both. It is the decision to let consequence arrive without your body blocking the door. It is signing what must be signed, saying what must be said, and refusing, finally, to translate betrayal into misunderstanding for the comfort of those who committed it. There was no triumph in watching my son read a suspension notice under chandelier light. There was no pleasure in seeing my daughter realize she had confused polish with immunity. There was only the severe relief of putting facts where lies had been. And yes, there was something in me that wanted them to feel the cost. I would be lying if I denied that. They had measured out my decline over drinks in my wife's library. They had priced my home, my mind, and my absence. I wanted them to understand, with perfect accuracy, what it meant to discover that the old man in the corridor had heard every word. That is revenge. Not the destruction of your enemy, but the withdrawal of the protections he mistook for his own intelligence. I still live at Blackwater. The river keeps its counsel better than most people. On certain evenings, Oliver runs ahead of me down the west lawn with one of Helen's old dogs in mind, though the dog has been dead 6 years and exists now only in stories. I let him talk. Boys deserve uninterrupted nonsense before men teach them usefulness. In the library, I had the drinks cabinet moved back to the wall and Helen's chair reupholstered in the dark green she preferred. I kept the desk. I kept the pen. Sometimes I stand in the doorway at dusk and remember the exact angle of firelight on the carpet the night I learned what my children intended for me. I am not grateful for the knowledge. Gratitude is for clean things. But I respect what it forced. It made me clear where grief had made me vague. It made me see that mercy, offered too long to the wrong people, becomes collaboration. It made me understand that a father can love his children and still deny them the right to finish what they began against him. If that sounds hard, it is. Most truths worth keeping are. Helen used to close doors softly, even in anger. She said loud exits are for people who still hope to be called back. When I think of what I did to Daniel and Eve, I think of that. I did not slam anything. I simply closed the door with care, and this time I made certain the latch held.